I'm a clinical psychologist. I study mental health, and in particular, I study how we diagnose and monitor the development of mental health, like Amelia mentioned. And today, I'm really happy to talk to you about work over the past 10 years or so on a mental health condition called borderline personality disorder. And so I'll just be describing what traditional understanding of borderline PD is and how it's changed over the past decade or so of longitudinal research on this condition. And I'll try to suggest things that we can take away from that research literature, whether it has to do with research implications or clinical implications. Yeah, thank you again. All right, so I'll get started. What is borderline personality disorder? In the United States, we recognize it through the experience of a few celebrities, like a comedian pictured here, Pete Davidson, or an American football player, Brandon Marshall, or scientist, Marsha Linehan, who created a popular psychotherapy for borderline personality disorder, and who later, kind of recently, maybe 5 years ago, expressed her own experience with the condition. According to our modern classification systems, the borderline personality disorder is defined by these 9 characteristics, these 9 diagnostic criteria, which we can group according to content or phenomenology, which is just a big word that means what it feels like to experience the mental health symptoms. So there are some affective, meaning emotional symptoms like intense and difficult to control anger, feelings of chronic emptiness, and feeling that your moods or emotions change constantly, like from hour to hour. There are some cognitive symptoms such as paranoia or dissociation that occurs particularly under periods of peak stress or challenge, and also identity disturbance, which refers to difficulty understanding who I am and who I want to be and what my values and preferences are. Some behavioral symptoms of the condition include non-suicidal self-injury, meaning I'll hurt myself without intending to die, and also suicidal behavior, so attempting to kill myself or killing myself. And in this same class of behavioral systems, there are other forms of self-damaging behavior, impulsive things like driving too fast or too much substance use or risky sexual behavior. And finally, there are key interpersonal features of the disorder, including what are called frantic efforts to avoid abandonment, meaning I'm trying everything I can do to avoid the perception of being abandoned or other people leaving me, and experiencing unstable or tumultuous relationships. So this is the constellation, the group of symptoms that make up the condition. In the United States, we'll often use the DSM to diagnose borderline PD. And the DSM requires that there are at least 5 out of those 9 diagnostic criteria present in order for the diagnosis to apply. A fancy word that we use for that method of combination is polythetic, which refers to the fact that any combination of 5 out of these 9 symptoms will suffice to diagnose the condition. And that sort of flexibility translates into many different possible symptom combinations satisfying the diagnostic criteria, which means, of course, that borderline PD is what we call a heterogeneous, meaning complex condition. It can look like many different things. In fact, any 2 patients with the same diagnosis of borderline PD might have only 1 symptom in common. What do we know about the prevalence and demographics? Well, it seems to apply to about 1 to 2% of people in the general population around the world, and a much larger percent of people who are in clinical care, including 10% of outpatients and about 20% of inpatients. So what this means for the mental health community, and I suppose healthcare in general, is that even if we don't have much familiarity with the personality disorder world or borderline PD in particular, we will be encountering in any sort of typical clinical setting, and I would say any sort of healthcare setting, people with borderline PD, probably every day. Most people and most clinicians aren't too familiar with personality disorder in general, but they have heard of borderline PD. And so why might it come up so often, like in consultation meetings, team meetings with coworkers? Well, it's because there are very high rates of self-injury and suicide. Up to 10% of people with a borderline PD diagnosis end up dying by suicide, which of course is something like 50 times the rate of the general population. People with borderline PD also struggle to establish solid relationships with the clinicians who are working with them. And they are in frequent contact with the healthcare system and mental health care in particular. Compared to other sort of patient groups, they are often in clinic offices, whether it's for high intensity treatment like emergency room visits or lower intensity treatment like visits to primary care physicians for medication prescriptions. Borderline PD is also notorious. It's well known for its comorbidity, meaning that people with borderline PD also tend to have at least one other mental health condition that they're struggling with. Predominantly anxiety, depression, eating, and substance use conditions, as well as other personality disorders. All right, so this is my introduction to borderline PD, particularly for those who don't specialize in this area. And it reminds me to say I am happy to pay attention to the chat or to listen up for questions at any point. Please pause me if I'm forgetting something important, or if there's anything I can add to this description and the rest of the talk. Please stop me at any time. So now to talk about stability and instability in borderline PD. The whole idea of change in borderline PD might sound like an oxymoron, which is a fancy English word that means something that's paradoxical or impossible, because the general definition of personality disorder in our classification systems says that it's a condition that's enduring and pervasive and inflexible. It applies across time and across contexts. That's the whole idea behind personality disorder. So the notion that borderline PD might change at all historically was not accepted. It was a non-starter. In fact, historically, a whole distinct axis or chapter or dimension of DSM was created to represent the personality disorders so that clinicians could distinguish those enduring conditions from more acute or episodic, what were called Axis 1 clinical conditions. These are the mental health conditions that we probably hear of more often, like schizophrenia or ADHD or eating disorders or panic disorder. So there's been a lot of change, a big shift in recent thinking on personality disorder that has led us to the idea that borderline PD might be variable over time. So my whole idea here is to present this work, almost all of it from other people, so that you can understand how that development has taken place. I was thinking about this, I think about 10 years ago or so, when I was writing as a trainee about whether we might have evidence that might update clinicians' view, psychologists' view of whether and how borderline PD can change. And a lot has emerged in the literature since then. So we're getting a much more complex, nuanced view of how borderline PD might change over time. So the way that I want to communicate all this information is by mentioning just a handful, just a few long-term studies on the development of borderline PD, and I list them here. I like to start with 2 clinical studies in the top 2 rows here, called the Collaborative Longitudinal Personality Disorder Study and the McLean Study of Adult Development. And if I have enough time, I'll mention these last 2 studies, which have to do with community-based samples. So not clinical, but community-based samples that will speak to borderline PD's natural pattern of development, particularly in childhood and adolescence. So I'll start with this first study, which is abbreviated CLPS, C-L-P-S, Collaborative Longitudinal Personality Disorder Study. So for this one, a landmark study, a very famous study in the history of research on personality disorder, across 4 sites in the northeastern part of the United States. This big consortium, big team of investigators recruited over 600 adults, mostly those who are in outpatient care, who are in young or middle adulthood. And they administered, over the course of 10 years, 5 interviews that assessed for borderline personality disorder. And somehow, I'm not exactly sure, but they were able to keep in the study, the vast majority of patients. And these involved a few different diagnostic groups, which you can see over here. There was a big group of people who were diagnosed with borderline PD, and also sizable groups diagnosed with these other 3 personality disorders: obsessive compulsive, avoidant, and schizotypal PDs. So one of the objectives of the CLPS study was to compare the time course, the longitudinal trajectory of symptoms in borderline PD to symptoms in other personality disorders. So sometimes in the research world, we call this a psychiatric control condition. We have these other personality disorders that we're comparing longitudinally to borderline PD. There was an additional group of people, about 100 people, who were diagnosed with major depressive disorder, but no personality disorders. So the investigators could compare borderline PD's development to how a classically episodic condition might change over time. And one of my favorite studies from this entire 10-year study had to do with follow-up over the very beginning of that interval. They studied what's called rapid remissions. So they did, I don't know how they got enough money or time or energy to do this, but I think monthly interviews with people over this first couple of years of the study. And they paid attention in particular to people diagnosed with borderline PD at baseline who they could follow up a couple of years later. And they found out through these interviews that a substantial number, well, let me say small, but significant number of people, 23, had lost their borderline PD diagnosis in just 6 months. They defined remission as experiencing any 2-month period with 0 to 2 symptoms of borderline PD, which I think is a fairly conservative definition of remission. And most of them, 18 out of the 23, had kept their remission. Their disorder was nowhere to be found, all the way from the 6-month to the 12-month follow-up. So this was a huge surprise because borderline PD was meant to be a very stable condition that wouldn't be responsive to changes in people's lives or personalities over such a short span. Even more surprising was that most of these remissions occurred almost immediately, and there was very few relapse. So they were excited by the finding, and they wanted to be able to explain how this could happen. And so they tried to understand what might have been happening in people's clinical presentation and their lives and their treatment that would account for these sort of rapid remissions. And they found, well, we might have made one mistake in diagnosis at baseline, but that doesn't explain most of this. That was just an isolated event. For a lot of people, there were situational or environmental changes that were assessed using this instrument that the investigators thought could account for change in borderline PD. These were things like losing custody of a child. So custody means, guardianship over your child in the legal system, or getting divorced, separating from your partner, living with somebody new, or even sharing a secret with your family. I think one of the patients had come out as gay or lesbian, during the course of the study, and this accounted for a major change in their mental health condition. And 7 of the remissions appeared to be due to the resolution, the ending of Axis 1 conditions like clinical disorders like PTSD or panic disorder or OCD or schizophrenia. When those remitted, so did the borderline PD. So this one study, which is pretty small, this is by no means the most famous study out of that overall project, showed us something important. Borderline PD might be much more variable than anybody had ever expected. And when there's improvement in borderline PD, it can stick around, it can be sustained, instead of somebody immediately experiencing a relapse in the condition. And finally, we might be able to get information about people's prognosis from their environment. The things that are happening around you, where you live, who you're with, what medication or therapy that you're experiencing, those might have a lot to do with how your condition changes. And that hadn't really been in the foreground in the research literature previously. I love that study. But the more famous finding that's come out of the CLIPS project has to do with the full 10 years of follow-up that this study was able to deliver. So compared to that last paper that I mentioned, this one adds 8 more years of follow-up. And it addressed rates of remission over that full span. And what they found was pretty astonishing. They found that when remission was defined as 0 to 2 borderline PD symptoms for at least 1 year, 85% of people with borderline PD were observed to remit at some point over those 10 years of follow-up. And after they lost their diagnosis, they didn't quickly earn it back, meaning that relapse, which is defined as experiencing the full 5 out of 9 diagnostic threshold for borderline PD for at least a year. When relapse is defined that way, only 10% of those who remitted were judged to have relapsed. These are some graphs from that paper that help to illustrate what's going on. This is actually a complicated figure. Let me talk you through it. It shows cumulative rates of remissions. Cumulative meaning the number is going up constantly. It doesn't matter if people subsequently lost their healthy status. So the x-axis here, the horizontal axis, shows the months of follow-up. So the first month of follow-up here, the 120th month of follow-up, so 10 years down here at the end. And the y-axis is the cumulative percentage of remitted cases. And this legend up here shows 2 pieces of information. Are we looking at borderline PD or other personality disorders? Remember, schizotypal, avoidant, and obsessive compulsive personality disorders were the comparison conditions. Or are we looking at major depressive disorders? And it also defines remission according to 2 months or 12 months of absence of symptoms. All right, so you can see this blue line here, indicating that major depressive disorder is the quickest condition to resolve by far. It looks like by about a year here, we're looking at over 80% of people being remitted. Let's see, so the purple line here in the middle is borderline PD, defined as 2-month period being symptom-free as qualifying for remission. And you can see that while it doesn't change as quickly as major depression, it does change pretty quick. You can see that by the end of the study, like we had said before, 85% of people had remitted. By 6 months, you can see that about 10% of people had remitted, which is what they reported in that earlier study about rapid remissions. And the number just keeps climbing consistently. So you can see that there's a lot of remission, but it's not as quick as major depression. This graph shows the rates of relapse with the same sort of legend, same x-axis. And you can see that major depression is characterized by much more relapse than personality disorders. So people with personality disorder are slower after they've remitted to return to a clinical threshold. And by the way, across these two graphs, what we're seeing is that borderline PD is a little bit slower to remit and a little bit quicker to relapse than other personality disorders. All right, I don't see any questions or comments in the chat so far. So when the CLIPS investigators were puzzling over the variability in this diagnosis, one hypothesis that they thought was promising was that different features of borderline PD might behave differently over time. So there might be some borderline PD features that are stable and some that aren't. And so they tried to study that over time. They called it a hybrid hypothesis. So over 2 years of this study, they found that some of the symptoms remitted more quickly than others. So over 2 years, about half of people who experienced self-injury symptoms saw those remit, whereas only about a fifth of people who experienced impulsivity saw those symptoms remit. So they thought, borderline PD might be made up of this different groups of symptoms, some stable and some not. And so that hypothesis was influential for a while, but after the full 10 years of follow-up, the CLIPS team saw that all of these 9 diagnostic criteria for borderline PD changed at just about the same rate. So there was a discrepancy between what they saw at 2 years and what they saw at 10 years. It looks like when you zoom out over a long enough period of time, that there's not very strong evidence for the idea that some of the borderline PD symptoms are very stable, whereas others are more variable. So that hybrid hypothesis has not been so prominent in the literature recently. So I'm going to describe one of my studies with this CLIPS data set now. I was thinking, given the pattern of remission and relapse that they had found over the study, it might be oversimplifying things. Like the hybrid hypothesis, for instance, might be oversimplifying things to conceptualize borderline PD, whether the entire set of symptoms or some individual symptoms is either unremitting, stable, or episodic. My question was, what if there were stable and unstable components to all these features? And could we separate those to figure out how big each of those might be? And I, with some coworkers, tried to address that question with factor analysis over time. What that looks like is, well, it's a little complicated, so I'm going to walk through it step by step. in the context of one time point, one wave of that study. The idea behind factor analysis, or confirmatory factor analysis in this case, is that you can summarize the common psychopathology, the common mental health problems among the 9 borderline PD diagnostic criteria at any one moment with a single latent variable. A latent variable is unobserved, something that we don't have in our data set, but we assume to exist and to account for the covariance among the observed features of the disorder. So the big circle here represents borderline severity at any one wave, well, in particular, the first wave of the study. And these rectangles represent the observed symptoms. These circles here at the bottom just represent error, parts of an individual symptom that are not shared across all 9 symptoms and therefore aren't captured in this common trait, this common feature. The subscripts just stand for like what wave of the study you're at. All of these symptoms were assessed at wave 1, for instance. The second subscript refers to which of the 9 borderline PD symptoms we're looking at. We can do this same process across all 5 waves of the CLIP study. So we can create that same factor analysis model, one common core to the 9 symptoms assessed at any given wave at the second, third, fourth, fifth time point. I removed the rectangles here just to keep the diagram simpler, but you can imagine that they're there for each one of these waves of data collection. The borderline PD features were correlated from wave to wave, and that represents the continuity of symptoms over time. So the correlations tell us, oh, people who are high relative to their peers on borderline PD features at time 1 were also relatively high at the other time points. That's what these double-headed arrows between the different borderline variables represent. The correlations aren't 1.0, they're not perfect, but they're not small either. So this is how we would normally represent the longitudinal relationships between borderline PD at different waves, different time points in a study. But we could take a leap of faith, we could make a strong theoretical prediction to suppose that the reason that all of these borderline features across these different time points are correlated is that there's a perfectly stable or trait-like piece to borderline PD that contributes equally to its expression at all these different waves of the study. In cases where this trait is very big, BPD would be expected to look super stable. And if this trait factor were fairly small, borderline PD would seem to be variable over time. And we decided to call this hypothetical phenomenon, this hypothetical trait, borderline proneness, where proneness is kind of a weird word even for me, but proneness just means, what does it mean? Just an enduring tendency or predisposition to experience something. We should have named it something else. But a model that only predicted stability would be incomplete. We know that from those findings of remission and relapse that were coming out of the CLIP study. So we decided to add another set of factors, one that's called occasion factors, as opposed to the trait factor, that contributes to individual differences in borderline PD only temporarily. That might summarize things like I'm taking a new medicine, or I ended an important relationship, or I had a baby, I got a therapist who really pushes me to think about myself, or I got back with that same romantic partner, but in a more supportive way this time. All these different occasion factors are things that might occur over brief spans, and they might even persist for a short amount of time, which is what these regression paths represent in the diagram. But by definition, they do not endure over the entire study period. So to summarize what's going on in this framework that we applied to the CLIPS data is that we completely divided the individual differences in borderline PD at any one point in time into a fixed time invariant piece, a trait, and a time varying, more fluid piece called an occasion factor. So at any one point in time, let's say the third wave here, we can completely partition, completely break down the differences in your and mine and our peers' borderline PD symptoms into a perfectly stable component and a component that varies across time. And we knew that from clinical wisdom and even the research literature on borderline PD that what you'd expect is a big trait factor because borderline PD is thought to be super stable. That's the definition historically. What we actually found was that this trait accounted for a minority of the individual differences in borderline PD features at any given wave. Only 45% of the total variation in borderline PD could be attributed to borderline proneness. So by process of elimination, that means that a little bit more than half, around 55% of the differences in severity can be attributed to transient or acute things that don't exert a constant influence on borderline PD symptoms. So to put it more plainly, there is a very stable core to borderline PD features in these outpatients diagnosed with PDs, but it's not as big as we imagined. And independent of that borderline proneness that somebody brings to their 4th year, 6th year, 10-year assessment, they're also experiencing changes in their treatment and their environment that are having a influence on their borderline PD symptoms. Which I think not only is interesting clinically because it changes how we think about prognosis for borderline PD, but also from a research point of view. It's worth mentioning that you can't really study change in borderline proneness. It's defined as something that doesn't change. So if you're studying an intervention or some naturalistic, some naturally occurring predictor of change, you're going to really dilute, you're going to really diminish the signal that you're looking for if you don't separate out the borderline proneness from the more variable piece of borderline PD. And by contrast, if you wanted to know something about the unchanging causal factors for borderline PD, you'd want to instead parse out, you want to separate out the dynamic variance, the stuff that changes from time to time, because that's just going to be noise from your perspective. That's just going to hurt your signal. If you're a, let's say, geneticist or somebody who's studying, stable biological or even environmental predictors of the core of borderline PD. So I like you can take away some research ideas about how to study borderline PD from this finding as well. Well, there are many more publications from that CLIPS project, but I want to tell you more about the second clinical study, which is called the McLean study of adult development. This happened outside Boston, Massachusetts, and a team of investigators followed inpatient adults who are young adults every 2 years for a long time. I don't think they've stopped, as a matter of fact. I think the study is still going, and there are amazing retention rates. There's some sort of magic happening where everybody enrolled in the study who's still alive continues to participate with extremely few exceptions. So this is an amazing database to help us learn about the development and change in borderline PD. There was a big group of patients at the beginning of the study who were diagnosed with borderline PD with extremely rigorous diagnostic standards, and a smaller group who were diagnosed with other personality disorders, OPD, but not borderline PD. So the setup of the study is very similar to the CLIPS. And they produced very similar findings, which were published right around the same time. When they defined remission in borderline PD, according to not meeting symptom threshold over a full 2 years of follow-up, they found that across 16 years, virtually all of the patients had remitted. And many of those remissions, the vast majority of those remissions, lasted 8 or more years. This is a busy slide. So for now, let's just focus on the blue and the red bars, which represent cumulative remission rates for people with borderline PD in blue and other personality disorders in red. So we're going to forget the green and orange bars for now. On the x-axis, you can see the years of follow-up that were completed. And on the y-axis, you can see this cumulative rate of remission. So it starts at about a third of people with borderline PD remitting after just 2 years, and it climbs up to about 90%, 9 out of 10 people with borderline PD having a remission by 10 years. And it's sort of, we would say, asymptotes. It reaches an asymptote or a flat line or a plateau there. The people with other personality disorders, represented in red, remit even faster and they plateau faster. It's just an amazing, unexpected finding. However, consistent with a more variable conceptualization of borderline PD's course, they also found that about 36% of the sample of patients with BPD at baseline, the people in blue bars here, went on to have a recurrence after 2 years. And 10% of the people who had experienced an 8-year remission went on to have a recurrence after even such a long period of being without the condition. So just like in CLIPS, they saw that there was a good deal of remission and a substantial amount, but not an equivalent amount, of relapse. So borderline PD is behaving a lot like anxiety disorders and other clinical disorders over time. One innovation, one new thing that happened in the McLean study of adult development, MSAD, that wasn't addressed in CLIPS was that they focused on something called recovery. They defined recovery as not only experiencing symptom remission, but also having a full-time work or academic position and a supportive relationship. This idea surfaced around the same time that in the CLIPS study, a separate publication found that social impairment, people's dysfunction in their relationships and work and leisure activities, did not change in sync with or at the same time with their borderline PD symptoms. So people in the CLIPS study, even those who were free of borderline PD now, continued to experience major social dysfunction. So this idea of recovery in the MSAD study, I think, is compatible with that finding from CLIPS. All right, so what did the MSAD team find with respect to recovery? Well, let's return to that graph we were looking at a second ago. This again is the 16 years of follow-up of people with borderline and other PDs. This time we're focused on the green and the orange bars. They represent recovery rates for people with borderline PD in green and other PDs in orange. So they found recovery was harder to come by. It was more difficult to achieve. You can see here by the 16-month follow-up, if we zoom 16-year follow-up, if we zoom all the way to the end, 60% as opposed to the 99% for remission of people with borderline PD had experienced recovery over at least 1-2 year period. And that was higher for people with other personality disorders. So recovery is possible, but it is not as rapid nor as common. And it is more difficult to achieve for people with borderline PD than other PDs. I want to mention one more interesting study out of the MSAD project. And there are probably hundreds of articles published from this one data set, this one project. But one that I like in particular has to do with how people with borderline PD engage with the healthcare system. I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that one of the distinctive features of borderline PD is that this population has super high rates of treatment use. A lot of that, well, we kind of know that in a clinical setting anecdotally, meaning clinicians will often talk to one another about how many patients with borderline PD they're seeing and how regularly they come in. But there hasn't been a lot of strong research that documents this phenomenon. But that's what this study in the MSAD did. For 16 years of follow-up, they examined multiple different forms of treatment and how people with BPD engaged with them. And their findings were really, really interesting. After 16 years of follow-up, the people with BPD compared to people with other personality disorders were more likely to be taking psychiatric medication, and particularly many medications at the same time. They were more likely than people with other personality disorders to be in residential treatment, meaning you live at the treatment facility, another high intensity form of treatment. And they were more likely to be hospitalized. But the funny thing is that, bad transition. This is a graph of the rates of hospitalization for people with borderline PD. This is in blue, and other personality disorders in red. You can see over the 16 years that compared to people with other personality disorders, people with borderline PD were more likely to be hospitalized for an emergency mental health problem. You can see that at any year of follow-up, including baseline. But another interesting thing to notice from this graph is that rates of hospitalization decline over follow-up, but not linearly. The decline stops here. So after the first half of follow-up, it plateaus. It becomes a straight line such that the rate of hospitalization remains constant from years 8 to 16. And that same trend is something that they observed across a lot of other high intensity treatment forms. The thing that I thought maybe was most interesting from this whole study is that people with borderline PD were not more likely than people with other PDs to be in more standard low intensity forms of mental health treatment, including individual psychotherapy, meaning one-on-one psychotherapy with a psychotherapist, which you see here, or couples therapy, or family therapy. So the things that we can see from this graph is that the blue and the red bars are not as different as before. There's not a big discrepancy between people with borderline and other PDs and how much they're involved in individual psychotherapy. And it also doesn't drop. The rate doesn't drop as much over the follow-up for either group. And this is the corresponding graph for couples therapy, meaning therapy that you attend with your romantic partner to improve your relationship. I made these three graphs based on their tables. That's why they look so bad. So don't blame them for that. So what did we learn from that study? People with borderline PD are super engaged with the mental health care system, and particularly high cost, high intensity treatments. And even as many of the patients in this study remitted, their borderline PD diagnosis went away, they remained in contact, engaged with the mental health care system. And that was to a greater extent than people with other personality disorders. Except in the case of these lower intensity treatments like one-on-one psychotherapy, which are way more common and popular. So the general picture that emerges here is that people with borderline PD tend to be in higher intensity treatments, and they tend to remain in those treatments even after their symptoms remit. And I think that this parallels MSAD findings and CLIPS findings regarding psychosocial functioning, meaning, recovery. It seems that even if borderline PD itself changes, there are other parts of the person, whether their mental health picture or their environment, that remain difficult and might block full recovery from psychopathology. All right, final slide. I want to see if I can give a general impression about what we learned from these two extremely important clinical studies of how borderline PD can change in adulthood, because they really changed the field's understanding of the nature of borderline PD. Number one, the condition is way less stable than we previously thought. Remission is more common if we're talking about diagnosis over time. And many of the people whose diagnosis remitted stay remitted, and over long periods of time too. If we instead look at individual differences in symptoms as opposed to categorical diagnoses, the study that I was involved with was able to show us that about half of the differences between patients at any one moment in time in borderline PD severity can be attributed to, they are caused by some extremely stable, inflexible, pervasive borderline proneness that is consistent with the historical definition of borderline PD. But of course, half of the differences between us in borderline severity at any one point in time are unrelated to that fixed borderline proneness. So together, those two findings suggest a way more positive prognosis, a way more positive picture of how symptoms might change over time, which is important to patients and families and communities and healthcare systems who are dealing with borderline personality disorder. But it's not an entirely positive picture. And I think the findings related to recovery highlight that. Recovery is related, but a distinct phenomenon that probably needs more attention in the clinical literature. People with borderline PD have more trouble keeping jobs and maintaining emotionally supportive relationships than even people with other personality disorders do, and people with other mental health conditions like major depression, let alone people without any mental health complaints. And one of the reflections of that difficulty sustaining recovery might be the engagement of this population in high intensity, including emergency mental health services over a long period of time. All right, I'm gonna skip through what the information from the community studies of personality disorder, but I'm happy to address those in questions in the question and answer period. And I am very happy to talk with you over email or over Zoom if you have any sort of questions after today, of course. And more of my work is on this topic is available on my website listed here. So thank you very much for your attention.